Welcome to the BrettJohnson.biz podcast, where we discuss business on purpose, radically fresh leadership, capital that transforms society, and marketplace stories that embolden difference makers. Well, welcome to the Repurposing Business podcast. I'm here today with James Waters, and I'm excited to introduce him to you. James, as we got going on this topic, I was reminded of the early days when we started the Institute, and people just say, what's the Institute? In fact, I had a friend of my daughter's. The dad told my daughter one day, I figured out what your parents do. They work for the CIA because they have this company called the Institute. They go all over the world. Nobody really knows what they do, you know. So he thought he'd figured it out, but it's the Institute for Innovation, Integration, and Impact. And once I met a guy by the name of John Seeley Brown, and John had written a book on innovation. He used to work at Xerox PARC, and from Xerox PARC we got the mouse. Some people say we got the Apple Macintosh and other things coming out of that lab. And he'd written this book on called Beyond Innovation, I think it was. And I told him the full name of the Institute, and he said, oh, I'm glad you have all of the I's. He said, but because you can have innovation, but without integration, you don't get impact. So he saw it right away. So, and you're a specialist in impact. And so I'm excited to chat with you today, James. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, it's such a joy to be with you, Brett.
So, James, tell us a bit about your story and your journey, your life story, and your development, and how you got interested in this whole area of impact. Tell us your story.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so I started off working in international development and research. My training was actually in kind of ecology and environmental sciences. I came to faith in my last year of university, and I honestly didn't quite know what I wanted to do with my life. And so I was getting work experience in different African nations. And then as I graduated around the time of the financial crash, I did a PhD looking at the resilience of slum dwellers, which was just incredible, a really formative year in terms of just getting a heart for mission and serving the poor, and also I guess developing my inner geek on measuring the intangible and measuring impact. And for me, it was always about people. As I moved from kind of the environmental sciences more to kind of understanding people, and just fascinating trying to work out through my PhD, looking at what caused resilience or vulnerability to crisis in such a difficult place as inner city slums. And then kind of
you're interested in slums. I mean, why? I mean,
yeah,
you could do economic, resilience among investment bankers in London. So what got you interested in slums?
It's so true. Actually, since then, I've realized that actually the concept of resilience and human resilience completely cross-cuts society and socioeconomics, etc. But in terms of slums, honestly, it was just as I was doing my master's, I sort of started to understand urbanization. And I think at that point, there were 1.3 million people a week moving to cities. And it just was one of the macroeconomic trends that as I was doing my studies, I was fascinated by. Yeah. And slums for me are one of the most, there was a book I read, something like Slum of Hope or Slum of Despair. Like you could literally see the same, place or population through a really glass half empty or glass half full. I just found them fascinating kind of microcosms of humanity and ecology to study. So that's why slums.
And did you spend any time in Africa?
Yeah. So I did. So my previous studies, more on the ecology side, I was in many East African countries, South Africa. At one point, I thought I was going to be a ranger in South Africa. The idea of being out in the bush all day. I did a tropical biology course in Kenya. But for my PhD, I was in 3 different slums in Kampala, Uganda, and lived there for a year. And it was just incredible. So I started off learning enough of the language. I got a private tutor at the university to learn enough Luganda, so the local language, to Kampala. I learned how to kiss my teeth and taught local like slum Uganda. And so people thought this white guy's not going to last a minute. But I learned how to basically talk gang Luganda. And so it meant that I ended up having interviews with, yeah, gang leaders and prostitutes and anyway, all sorts. And I had a blast, and it
Yeah.
was, yeah, a very special time.
So I'm fascinated to know what that. I'm sure you had textbooks metrics that you were coming across when you were doing international development studies and other things, and then you had the actual stuff you saw on the ground. How connected were they, or how disconnected were they?
Yeah, that's a great question, and actually mirrors the kind of the work I do now in terms of measuring spiritual impact. So exactly as you say, like there were some really robust metrics around, say, income or sort of general well-being. But actually, I managed to find an academic who had done what I wanted to do, i.e., um, not just make up questions, because it's too easy to basically think that you know the answer, make up the question,
Yeah.
and then think of robust data, but actually develop statistically validated surveys
Okay.
that captured the things that, you know, let's say you're trying to measure hope, which was
Hmm.
actually one of our determinants. You know, it's not good enough just to think you know how to ask whether somebody is hopeful and ask that question, right? So there's ways of asking good questions. So anyway, I found someone who had a methodology, a way to do this, and so it was very much a combination of learning from metrics that were already validated, say around income, and
Yeah.
then where they weren't, actually saying, you know, for this specific context, let's say, you know, yeah, it was hope or agency or different things like that. Um, Actually uh, developing validated surveys
Yeah.
or
James,
categories.
I wonder if we can back up a little bit to the question, and this is for people of faith, why measure? Because I see two different groups over there. In other words, there's one group that says, look, everything's got to be decent and in order. It's got to be measured. There's a whole book in the Bible called Numbers. And so God's an accountant. And so we're all going to have to give an account. And so there's that group. And there's the other group that says, oh no, David took a census and he got whacked on the head. So, I'm not measuring.
Yes,
In
yes,
fact, I remember being with a group in India, actually, and they came to us. We'd been working there for a little while, and three of the leaders came to me. Ironically, one of them had a company that sold software that integrated with Microsoft products to measure, you know, but they told me, we love your 10P model, except we don't need to do planning because Indians are smart, and we don't want to measure, because I mean we don't need to do that. We're smart. So it was interesting. So the next day I called them in and I said, you guys are Christian in terms of salvation, but you're Hindus in terms of your mindset, your worldview, which is fatalistic. So if you're
yeah, yeah,
fatalistic, you don't have to measure. Whatever's going to be is going to be. That's one of the whatever's going to happen is going to happen. That's one of the sayings of their guru. So just backing up to the thing, why measure? Did you grapple with that at all, or?
Oh yeah, I mean 100%. I think so. You know, the bit of my story I've told so far has been where I hadn't worked out how to integrate faith into what I was doing, or even how to think about spiritual impact. So to be honest, on the social side, no, there was just never really a question for me, right? Because I was in a discipline that was learning how to measure intangible things. You know, there's now validated measures of happiness. There's even nations that judge their success based on happiness. And so I was in a environment that didn't say if it's too hard we won't measure it. It said if it's too complex we'll find a way of measuring it, and that
Right.
might be qualitative. That might not necessarily be the traditional kind of survey and numbers. That might be actually through asking really great questions. It might be, there's now with the use of AI and various tech, there's ways to ask questions that even don't involve human interaction and that make people feel super safe. And so anyway, so my kind of secular training in this taught me that if it's hard to measure, it just means that you need to find a good proxy. As it then moved over, so about 6 years ago, 7 years ago, I quit my job in sort of secular international development, working with large organizations, Rockefeller, etc., to say, actually, how could the Christian space benefit from this, and could I bring my skill set there? And then had to wrestle with it, because I actually remember, I think it was one of the first calls I made as I quit my job, and I was excited about what was happening in impact investing and the development and deployment of social impact metrics, and people measuring the SDGs and saying, we're tracking job creation and economic development. That I remember one of the first Christians I spoke to said, yep, this is unethical, unbiblical, and you shouldn't do it. Stop trying to measure spiritual impact, basically. And it just sat me down. I just quit my job to try and to do this task. So I really had to wrestle with it. And I probably could spend the next hour talking about this, but very long story short, wrestle through the scriptures that you've mentioned. I remember actually, I used to lead a worship and prayer movement. God actually told me the scripture around David, do not count your armies. I remember vividly as a ministry leader, not feeling, and that was the right thing to do in that case, but also reading the parable of the talents, reading an amazing book by Bruce Wittick called The Shrewd Samaritan, and saying, actually, I think to be a good steward as a Christian can involve, measurement and stewardship of what we've been put into our hands, which isn't just financial. It involves social capital, it involves people, it involves spiritual, it involves our giftings. And so measurement is a way of, and so maybe we can unpack this a bit, but two of the concepts that I borrowed from a friend are around faithfulness and fruitfulness. And I think people often get them confused, right? And we're called to be both faithful and fruitful. But as it says in the scriptures, I sowed, Apollos watered, and God made it grow. Yes, God will always be, if we read John 15 and abiding in the vine, any true, lasting, eternal fruit will be, I believe, born of the Spirit, right? That true, lasting, eternal fruit. That doesn't mean that we won't have a part to play in it. And so faithfulness measures, i.e., are we doing our bit? Do we have good processes, right? Do we measure cash flow? Do we have a good impact strategy? Lots of things we could get into. I believe our part. Fruitfulness measures, we need to approach with a huge amount of humility, because ultimately that's where we're partnering with God. But I still believe we should track them, because it actually allows us to give glory to God.
So it's almost like you said, it's a bit like the Psalm 1, so when we talk about success, if success is a fruit, it's fantastic. Blessed is the man who's does these things, and he'll be like a tree planted next to a river, and so on. And so if it's a fruit, it's fantastic. If it's a pursuit, it can become an idol. So separating out the fruit and the pursuit, I think, is useful.
Very good.
Your fruitfulness, your faithfulness, that's fantastic. And but it's almost like in the computer world, the input, process, outputs. We've still got to do the input and the process well.
Right.
And then, there's a huge dynamic. I found out early on when I was leading a church, and I've seen it since then, that I could actually measure the presence of God. Was God present at a meeting? And
you're about to affect me. This is
and so
wow.
Among the super spiritual, they say, we saw a cloud or an angel, or we took something like that. No, I'm just talking about practical stuff. If I preached a sermon that was technically correct, but God wasn't there, I would say amen, and the building would empty in 2 minutes.
Right.
But I could preach a rubbish sermon.
Very good.
And God was there. Nobody wanted to leave. So I could measure the hang time after a sermon or at the end of a meeting, and that would let me know whether God showed up or not, because the principle is people are attracted to the presence of God. So it's like when Joshua and Moses would go into the tent, and Moses would leave and Joshua would stay just to hang around in the presence of God.
Very good.
And so now in the business world, we teach business leaders, customers, people, anybody is attracted to the presence of God. They don't have to be Christians. So when all of those were discontented and in debt and so on, went to David in a cave, it wasn't a great location. So people are attracted to the presence of God and have a sense, there's something in this place. I really like this place, and so forth. So you can measure who God brings across the path of your business randomly, not, and that's an indication of whether God is present in your company. So, and you can turn it into something on a scorecard.
Well, yeah, and you used a first of all, I feel like you're talking more about impact on this than me, which is great. But an example of exactly what you just said, I remember hearing Reinhard Bonnke, who's one of my heroes now in glory, speak at an event I was at. And honestly, I mean, being a complete Reinhard Bonnke fan, I was glued to every word. And I thought, this is not a good message. And yet then hundreds of people ran to the front, because there was something different. There was something on his message, that you call the anointing or whatever. And but just to pick up something else you said, you said that people, people coming across the path of your business or would be an indication. And that's, that's an impact word, right? We look for indicators. So we, what we do in terms of the process is, you set your impact strategy, or call it a theory of change, whatever. You define success, i.e. outcomes. But then underneath that, you say what indicators will say that we're kind of moving towards those outcomes. And so you're looking for indicators, right, of those outcomes being achieved.
Yeah. Good. Excellent. So you came to peace with the fact that God is an accountant after all. You're happier with that. But you're happy with,
sorry, go on.
Peace with, yeah.
I came to peace with the fact that I remember once feeling, whether it was from the Lord or whatever, that I feel like this phrase came to me once, that there's no truth worth its salt in the Bible that's not two truths held in tension. And I feel like with impact, basically, you just have to, especially spiritual impact, approach it with real humility. And it's this tension of obedience. And if, for example, somebody says that the Lord has called them to do something and they're currently not seeing fruit, who am I to argue with that? But similarly, in the process, we steward well, we have metrics, we have indicators, we see if we're to help us, guide us in that path, if we're on the right track. And that, so to sort of hold that, you could call it heart and mind, spirit and truth, whatever, however you want to, but hold that intention.
Yeah. So James, I want to transition and talk a little bit about the differences you experienced when you were working, as you said, with a secular organization or just a regular international aid organization or whatever, versus trying to work more with Christian organizations. I remember once I was on a flight to Jakarta from San Francisco, sat next to a guy who worked for Chevron, and he was going out there to do some work in an oil field. And he said, "What do you do?" And I told him in broad terms what we were doing with repurposing businesses in order to transform society. And he said, "You must have to measure in decades," which is interesting. So I wanted to ask you, there can be, just as there is on Wall Street, there can be a tension or a pressure for Christian organizations to give short-term metrics. Did you see a difference between the so-called secular world and the Christian world in terms of the sort of time frame and the scope of what they were looking for?
So in terms of time frame, well, let me first of all start in time frame of scope of what maybe we should be measuring, and then maybe I'll come into what I think people are asking for. So I would say actually that there are complex social outcomes that also take decades, right? Yeah. So if you think about the transformation of a city or a community, or purely in social terms, which, by the way, I don't have such a bifurcated view of the social and spiritual. I believe that the spiritual pervades everything, but also it can be seen as its own area. But also I think because the metrics have been more developed, we've basically found better proxies for those short-term outcomes when it comes to things like economic empowerment. Does that make sense? So there will be a good short-term metric for economic empowerment, be it job creation, but there'll still be a long-term outcome, say on a nation level, that probably will be more like a decade.
Yeah.
When it comes to the spiritual, I think it's similar. Yes, because most spiritual outcomes are complex. Yes, we do need to be thinking long-term. I mean, I was just hosting a workshop in Nairobi, Kenya, a month or so ago for this global Christian goals project I'm facilitating. And that was exactly one of the bits of feedback from a Kenyan entrepreneur is I'm thinking about spiritual impact that lasts decades, yet my investors are asking for short-term, monthly, if not, and annual type metrics. So it's a real problem. But I think again, it comes down to how you set those indicators, and not to get too technical, but as you go through a impact strategy or theory of change process, it's purely just saying, okay, there might be a long-term outcome that's complex and involves spiritual transformation, but what's the intermediate or short-term outcome that'll give you an indication that you're on that path? So I think it's sometimes that we're only thinking about the long-term outcome, and we haven't made the mental exercise of what would be the indicator of transformation along that journey.
Right. I like that. I really, really like that. In one of the projects we're involved with in South Africa, they've used the green light movement indicators, which you're probably familiar with. Started in Brazil, something else there, and then in South Africa they call it green light. And so it's an annual survey. Basically, they'll go in and meet with people, and there you can see the short-term indicators. So in one street, they went to every single house in the street, spoke to the grandparents, the parents, the kids, found out, and something practical like the unemployment was, say, 58%, and a year later, after they'd been working, it was in the mid-20s, which is great. Some indicators got worse because the people's expectations grew. So they thought, no, there is a better life. I could say, so there's an interesting one. So things are getting better, but the expectations change and the indicator gets worse for a period of time, almost like that hockey stick dip over there. Have you seen any of that?
Yeah, I mean, now imagine thinking that about spirituality, right? So, to be honest, there's different depths that you can go with kind of spiritual metrics, and it's only kind of when you go into a lot of depth that it starts to really like hurt the brain. But let me give you an example of this. So, the challenge with individual spiritual growth, say, which is one of the things that I help measure, is that it's so far from linear, right? So actually, one of the questions, so I host a learning community of people who really are pushing the kind of the envelope of measuring spiritual impact. And one of the questions that's come up, but honestly, we have no answer around, but I have some questions that I think could capture it, is what do you do with the dark night of the soul?
Yeah.
Right? How do you capture that? Are there actually some measures of spiritual maturity that, if your questions are a little bit shallow, would look like going in the wrong direction, but they're actually maturity, right? So maybe I'm going a little bit off the wall here, but I enjoy reading some of the ancient mystics, and some of them would talk about maturity is when you kind of actually feel a separation from God, and it's a testing and a maturing and a learning how to grow in the wilderness. And so, what do I do with that? That is so far from linear, right? And if I have a really simple one question of, do you feel close to God right now? No. But maybe actually they're on a phenomenal journey of depth and trust in the Lord. So when there are lighter touch indicators that probably would not get into some of those complexities. But yes, when we're thinking about spiritual impact, there's definitely some nuances and some irregularities, should we say.
Let me loop back to my earlier question. I asked you a two-part question. I should have broken it up. One was, do you find that regular organizations that are, say, doing things with the SDGs and so on versus Christian organizations, from a scope perspective, is it your experience that one has a broader scope than the other, or do you find them all to be project-based, or what's your experience on that?
So sorry, just say that again. So organization,
for example, say if I look, and I'll give you a little bit of a bias on my part, I think if there's a Christian investing in something, the easy metrics are, did we present the gospel to people? Did people get saved? Did they maybe get into a discipleship program or join a local church? And that's why people can sometimes shoot for those metrics and say the rest will take care of itself, because the things that you're trying to measure, like over 10 years, did Susie go from starting in education, getting out of poverty, to getting into higher education? I mean, that's a harder and a longer metric, for example. But then likewise, it's easier to measure, did we build a project in an orphanage in Kenya? that took care of 200 kids or whatever it might be, versus did we make a difference in Harare or Kampala or, some other city, for example, let alone a nation? Do you find that the more secular organizations, if you like, just to use that label, more willing to look at broader projects, or not really?
Broader projects or kind of broader impact?
Broader impact, looking at the impact on a city versus the impact on an orphanage.
So I think that's a great question. I think, without hopefully offending most of the kind of Christian audience, I think the reality is the kind of measurement from the Christian space is a couple, if not 10 years behind the social space, right? And so because there's further advancement in thinking about, say, measuring well-being, there can be a broader scope.
Yeah.
I think because there hasn't been much thinking and thought leadership around how do you actually both strategically, and that's not fair, there's some, definite exceptions. I'm thinking about the Global Strategic Forum in Bangkok in a couple of months. There's some amazing exceptions of strategic thought, Lausanne, strategic thought around Christian impact. But yeah, because a lot of the measurables have felt quite narrow, I think it then, and this is where there's an interaction between the measures of a project and the goals of a project, right? Because they feed into each other. And so I think, to sort of shamelessly mention this kind of global project that I'm facilitating, we're looking at measures such like community flourishing, generosity and sacrifice, cultural reconciliation. And so the hope is that will actually create a language and goals, if not metrics, for those projects to have higher scope, for investors to actually say, I know previously it's felt squishy, but we're going after goal 7 around cultural reconciliation and the subversion of power dynamics, like in a way that's going to empower this vulnerable community, like from the heart of Christ. Yeah. So I think part of it is as we hopefully create a broader language of the kingdom and kingdom impact, it allows some of those projects to think broader, and you measure what matters, and often activity follows that. And so the activity hopefully won't just follow the narrower definition, which, by the way, gospel witness is one of the goals. I think it's absolutely critical and imperative and core to the to the kingdom. But yeah, so hopefully this language will allow a kind of broader articulation of the kingdom impact, and what success means.
Yeah. I remember many years ago, when my kids were young, the youngest one wasn't the most athletic. And, when they're playing bunch ball soccer at 5 years old, you want to get them in the game. So I came up with a brilliant strategy. I said to him, Davey, you get 25 cents every time you touch the ball. Well, the problem was he destroyed the game because it went in any direction. I wasn't specific, right? Touch the ball towards getting this particular goal. It was just 25 cents every time you touch it. He kicked it to the other team. He kicked it in the other direction. Eventually, they took him off the field and they put him in the goals because he was really destroying the game. Yeah. So then he's the goalkeeper and he's supposed to do the goal kick, from the box. Puts the ball down, all the kids stand around, picks it up, moves it to the other side of the box, and I'm counting 25%. The ref's blowing the whistle, kick the ball, Davey, and so on. He's thinking 25 cents. And so, yeah, we sometimes put the 25-cent metrics in front of organizations instead of saying, okay, we actually want to win the game over here and be a team player and, do some other. Yeah.
That's a great example.
Yeah, good. So, right. Okay. So now your specific organization, you left the job that you're in, despite a bit of opposition about not doing this. You had a bit of soul searching. And so now you've been up and running for a number of years, and you're developing solid ways and frameworks of thinking about metrics. Tell us a bit more about what you're doing.
Fun. So I started off working with nonprofits, specifically with the Christian relief and development sector, just because they're already really advanced in this, right? So thinking organizations like Compassion or Hope International or Water Mission or Plant with Purpose. These are all organizations that have large monitoring and evaluation teams are thinking about holistic well-being and impact, right? And so it was kind of amazing and felt like one of the God moments on my journey that I went to a conference and honestly, I didn't have the answers, but I just kept asking. I just kept asking organizations, "Hey, do you have a standard way to measure spiritual impact? Would that be helpful?" And to be honest, like, would you pay for it? Because I needed to feed a family. And but I felt there was this real hunger from that group, and they said, well, yes, we do, but we all feel like we're working in isolation. And it would just be incredible to kind of pull that together. And I said, well, so I was the newbie, and I said, I just pulled together a lunch on the last day of this conference. And I said, look, you guys are the experts, not me. What if we collaboratively co-created something and we robustly tested it to come up with a standard way of measuring social and spiritual well-being? And so that's what we did for a couple of years. We pulled the amazing work. So Hope had their Hope metrics, which were incredible, and other organizations, etc. And we pulled those together under what's known as the Shalom framework, which is an amazing kind of theological concept of flourishing being relationship with God, self, others, and creation, but creation also being a work and work as worship, and basically built a framework around measuring holistic flourishing according to that Christ-centered model. To quickly fast forward an overview, so worked in that quite granular space of what does impact look like at an individual level. Also developed a psychometrically validated measure of Christian character, then started working with businesses to create some business tools, and now I'm working more at the fund level to come up with some global goals that I mentioned that would help kind of the articulation at a higher level. So that's a quick overview.
Fantastic. So the individual, the organization, and now
exactly.
Exactly. Those are three legs of your stool. Fantastic. And so just getting into a little bit of the dichotomy, you said you're not bifurcated in what you do, which is fantastic. That's great. Just as Wilberforce had as one of his big ambitions was the abolition of slavery, if you like. Mine is the abolition of dichotomy. So there we go.
Nice.
It's easier to see slavery than dichotomy sometimes. But what are the dangers of divorcing measurement from the routine of an organization? So some nowadays they talk about greenwashing, for example. Oh yeah, we've got our balance sheet, but we greenwash it so it looks like it's eco-friendly. We can do that on any topic. Do you come across that, and how do you counter that?
Yeah, very good. Well, somebody said of me recently, I was trying to explain what I do, and they said, "So are you effectively trying to avoid God washing?" I was like, "That's hilarious," or faith washing. And yeah, I mean that can be the real value of
faith washing is called whitewashing.
Yeah, there you go. Exactly. So we don't want that, and I genuinely believe that impact measurement can help towards that. So to answer your question, how do you avoid divorcing measures from the routine of an organization? So I think it's the critical part of this. I could talk about some of the sort of secondary things, but I think the critical element is that leadership needs to understand the value, and it needs to change the culture, right? So the organizations that I work with that are data driven and make data informed decisions, it's part of their culture. And I'm not just talking, I'm talking businesses, charities, funds, it cross cuts. And I'm not talking financial data, I'm talking impact data. So I think of one of the nonprofits that we work with, who are probably the most spiritual data driven organization. They're part of the learning community I facilitate. They're called International Care Ministries. They're incredible. Well, just as a testimony, they're also probably one of the most overt organizations I know about measuring spiritual impact. And they just landed millions of dollars from a completely secular funder who said, we never previously funded a Christian organization. But because of the robustness with which they go about their monitoring and evaluation, right? And because it's not just on the spiritual, it also, anyway, point being, this secular funder knows that it's not just like the marketing agency who are tasked with coming up and exaggerating some numbers and producing a pretty report, because when that happens, it's burdensome on the organization. It creates weird dynamics of vision and mission that like aren't integrated, and honestly, people who are smart enough can smell it a mile off. And so, but how do you integrate it? You know, in this organization that I'm talking about, they know that this is a critical element. And the amazing thing is, people running programs know that those programs might get cut if there's not a measurable impact. And they, you know, because their identity isn't in delivering their program, their purpose is in really seeing transformation in people's lives. And if they're not seeing that happen, well, let's stop wasting money. And I think it's the same in business, you know, whether it's the kind of employee care program or the way in which we do work, or, you know, any of these things. It's kind of an integrity and culture issue at its very core.
Mm. Okay, so sweet. I like that. That's great. So, I mean, I'm all for integrated metrics. I'm also for integrating disciple making into core business processes, and it's the same concept, you know. So you don't separate these things out. So AI, let's talk a little bit about AI, how AI can help us. So I had a guy in a podcast a year or so ago, and we were chatting, and he'd done some work in city transformation through economic transformation with actual metrics and numbers and so on in a very poor community here in the eastern part of the US. And so and he'd written a book on God and AI. And so we did a quick test. We said, okay, how would you transform Washington, D.C.? And we just asked ChatGPT, and it came back and said, Washington, D.C. is not mentioned in the Bible. However, you know, yes. And you can ask the question from a biblical perspective, you know, through the lens of, and it came back, I mean, really good answers about justice, about mercy, about truth, about, you know, a whole bunch of things. So I would imagine that there's ways for us to turn the intangibles into more tangibles using AI if we ask smart questions. And part of your own journey has been learning to ask the right questions, not going in with an answer. In fact, going in with an answer is bad news. Do you have any thoughts on that? Are you seeing any positive benefits, things that might have been harder to measure in the past, but now are more measurable? You mentioned, for example, as you think about it, employee joy. I sat with a group of companies down in Cape Town many years ago, and I said, let's say you walk into a business or a factory. What indicators would you see that the kingdom of God has come to this factory without talking to anybody, just in the area of people? And they came up with about 48 indicators or so. Now, some of them were redundant, but a whole bunch of things that you could have observed. You could look at, you know, turnover, absenteeism, gossip, and all just the joy, things that would give you an indicator of how happy these people are. So have you seen anything with AI that's going to make your life easier or the results better?
It's a great question. I am constantly learning, so I definitely am not an expert, but just a couple of examples. So one on the analysis. So for example, I've now run 5 workshops in 5 different countries for this Christian Impact Framework project, and kind of tested an outsourced analyst, qualitative researcher, and ChatGPT and Gemini. And you know, especially the latest models with ChatGPT 4 are just making some of that complex language analysis where, for example, complex data sets. One of the things is in analysis, turning qualitative data into very understandable, not necessarily quantitative data, but bite-sized information. So in that case, over 1,000 contributions of ways that people might articulate impact into one framework. So that's literally an exercise I've just done. Like, how do you define impact? Over 1,000 different inputs. Boom, we've now got a nice diagram. You know, that previously would have taken a huge amount. So in the analysis, the other is in the kind of input. So there's a fund I know that's using a tool that I guess in tech in 2 ways. One is using a bot to ask questions so that people ask completely trusting, you know, they know that it's fully anonymous. They know that there's not a person that's going to report back on them. And they are asked open-ended questions, not necessarily about the thing the question in hand. So let's say it's joy. They would just
Yeah.
say, what is it like working here? And
Yeah.
then you use AI to analyze the language and look for themes around joy. And so there's just a lot of ways, I think a lot of it's never going to replace the kind of strategic insight of humanity, I don't believe. But I think especially it's particularly good in simplifying complexity.
Yeah.
And so in both of those examples, where you can ask a simple question, get lots of information, and then dial it back down into something that maybe. And the other beautiful thing about it is there might have been something in there that you didn't even expect, right?
Yeah.
So that perhaps where a human had asked the question, they would have kind of taken it down.
Yeah.
Their bias would have led it.
Yeah.
You could now, one of the lovely things with surveys actually is you can train bots to like ask follow-up questions and effectively get at things, and even with a voice. And so you can now have an audio interaction with a survey that doesn't involve that doesn't involve a human being, but it's getting at things that perhaps a human with their bias might not have asked those questions around. And then you can analyze all that complexity of data. Anyway, so that's just a couple of examples. But
Great. Fantastic. Good. That's good to know. That's very interesting. I like that. Yeah. And it's that is wonderful. So just as we close out here, James, I want to ask you, you look at a lot of data, and there's an epidemic of pessimism among young people in the world from what I see. There's a narrative that says the world's going to hell in a handbasket. We're running out of resources. I watched recently a well-known TV guy who's not a Gen Zer. I mean, he's probably 50 years old, saying to Elon Musk, well, we're running out of resources. We're running out of this. We're running out of, everybody knows we're running out of water. And Musk was saying, actually, we're just running out of solutions. There's plenty of water if we just want to figure out how to deal with it and so forth. So what I would like to ask you is, what three metrics or trends are you most happy about when you look at everything going on and you say, through the eyes of Dr. James Waters, yeah, this gives me hope? And I'm asking this question at a time when there's riots in the streets in the UK, there's uncertainty in the US with elections, there's, all sorts of dynamics of what's happening in the world. Are there things that give you hope?
that's so good. Can you
By
just
the way,
pause
for the people who are listening to this, clearly I don't share any of my questions with people beforehand, so we can have a good
For the
conversation.
listeners, I expect you to have your three metrics ready, and I want 20 minutes to think about this, but I don't think Brett's going to give it to me. So my three metrics would be, one, I think would be the reduction in absolute poverty and the increase in well-being tied to not just reduction in poverty, but advances in medicine. I think even of someone within the kind of Christian Economic Forum community who's even taking medical advances to the developing world whilst challenging some of the broken and corrupt Western systems around that. So I just see some amazing stuff in terms of global well-being on a kind of.
You think about number two, right? So if you look at the last 100 years and you look at the percentage of people that are living in poverty, I mean, that's dropped radically. And we can slam capitalism. Certainly we can criticize greed, no problem with that. But economic progress has lifted a huge percentage of the population out of poverty. The chart is quite amazing.
Yeah, exactly. So that would be my first one. I know that's got a catch-all across kind of well-being and physical health, with some massive caveats around mental health in the West, etc.
Yeah.
The second, and I haven't got to a third yet. The second, which I actually do know some metrics, but they're not coming to mind, but is around spiritual hunger and desire for authenticity, in certainly amongst Gen Z and the youth. So I'm actually also involved in like a youth missions mobilization movement in the UK, and the stats are quite remarkable.
Yeah.
Gen Z is set to be the most missional generation that kind of that we have on record. That means that they're all in. That's really exciting to me from a kind of gospel witness. Yes, there's huge tasks, huge challenges in terms of like getting the gospel to them in authentic ways. I think they're amazing challenge. I think they're good challenges, right?
Mhm.
Like the desire for authenticity means that like they're not going to
Yeah.
just buy kind of performance Christianity from a stage. They want to see real life and real. And so I'm seeing that in the UK, and I think that's beautiful.
Yeah.
Um,
And I
my
would just affirm that as you think of your third one. I wrote a book a little while ago called Repurposing People, How to Find Work on Purpose in a Post-Pandemic Era. And it was prompted by a CEO who said, Brett, do you have an assessment that I can figure out whether the person that I'm hiring, in his case, a business partner, is a kingdom person or not? I mean, they're Christian, they subscribe, but how do I know? And it got me thinking about a bunch of things we put in place over the last 20 years or so. And there's a dilemma. On the one hand, you have the Gen Zers who want to work in an organization that is legitimate, it's authentic, they're doing meaningful work, etc. And they've got a smell test, a radar that can
right.
sniff that which is not authentic very, very quickly and be vocal about it. So I think on the other hand, you're wanting companies to attract good people. And they want people who are not empty suits, who are just aspirational, but they have no skills, they have no work ethic, etc. So it's
Yeah.
getting these two things together from both sides. And there's a huge opportunity there. And
Yeah.
unless we have authenticity, we could miss that opportunity to mobilize a generation, would you say?
100%. 100%. Yeah. 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 And it's even more stark in Gen Z than millennials.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So for my third drum roll metric, I probably should say, and I may or may not have asked Gemini in the meantime, I probably should say the increase in life expectancy or expansion of education or such global trends. But I'm going to say something different. That's not a sort of a normal metric, but it's kind of an indicator that I'm seeing. So reduction in absolute poverty, desire for authenticity amongst the youth generation, certainly I see in the UK. And then the third would be this, that, and it relates, that I'm actually seeing amongst secular thought leadership, a willingness and an openness to think about spirituality in a way that I don't think the church is particularly poised to take advantage of.
Yeah.
And so when we launched this learning community around measuring spiritual impact about 6 months ago, it was right around where so Harvard just landed $48 million to study human flourishing. Part of the model, which comes from a Christian academic, involves kind of the role of religious community. Yes, it's not kind of overt like faith per se, but there's language around that. You know, you're seeing secular businesses talk about bringing your spirituality to work. McKinsey's Health Institute now define health not just as physical health, but physical, social, mental, and spiritual health. So that's McKinsey defining, because they acknowledge. And so that kind of third metric that I see as so exciting is the number of global thought leaders who completely secular, saying, wow, to measure human flourishing, we need to engage with what spirituality means, because it's important for 9/10 of the world's population. Yeah. And what I said to this learning community is, right now, secular spaces are defining that. I am contending for the thought leadership and the data that we would have a Christ-centered articulation of human flourishing rather than, and yes, we would speak to and build on all of the amazing work from Harvard, but we would actually have evidence, data, and case studies around a Christ-centered articulation of human flourishing. And the last thing I'd say, and maybe this is the last thing, is I just completed this course called The Economics of Mutuality. It came out of the work around completing capitalism, where they truly have the data to show that if you put people and planet first, organizations are long-term more financially sustainable, right? Mars Foundation looked into this. My belief, and I think it's probably core to some of your work as well, is that there are spiritual principles that we may even prove through data that if you put at the center of organizations, it's the same as why Jubilee Economics is at the center of the economics of mutuality. If you put these kingdom principles that both individuals, organizations, and nation states will flourish. And my belief is that we could even track that through data. So
yeah,
that's my third area
that's
of
very, very good. That's very, very good. I thought you were going to say, having spoken about Reinhard Bonnke, the German evangelist who was so famous in Africa and elsewhere, that the new evangelists who are actually asking the questions of people like Jordan Peterson and Joe Rogan and Russell Brand. And I mean, that's quite interesting when you talk about the thinking coming from out there, who are people who are still trying to figure stuff out, but they're asking some pretty decent questions and acknowledging, we cannot ignore the spiritual world in trying to tackle the problems in the world. So, yeah. Okay, good. Yeah, very good. Many, many years ago in 2010, I wrote a book on repurposing capital, looking at different types of finance and so on. Interesting to see an economist out of China who studied what went on, was sent for a year to study what went on in the US. And he looked at the history and he went back to China and he said, the difference is the church. This is the difference in the economy and so on. So quite fascinating. Well, James, thank you so much for your insights. It's been good having a conversation. Lots of rabbit holes we could go down, but important stuff. And thank you for the work that you're doing in thinking about how do you measure impact and the importance of getting the metrics right as an indicator of how authentic are we in integrating in our faith into the fiber of our own personal lives and the organizations that we're leading. And then also, how big is our thinking? Are we 10 behind? What do we do to catch up? How do we get back in the game? And not just following somebody else's metrics, but thinking through how do we take them to the next level, fully supported by and infused with biblical truth. So thank you so much, James. How do people get a hold of you, by the way?
Yeah, so my email is james@kingdomimpact.co.uk. That's also my website, kingdomimpact.co.uk. And then if you want to find out more about the Christian Impact Framework Project, which is the global goals, you can follow us on LinkedIn.
Fantastic. James, thank you so much.
Awesome. Cheers, Brett.